Welcome back to the Neuro Symbolic Channel. With me today is Milo Lin, and Milo's group out of the University of Texas Southwest Medical Center has recently introduced some really innovative ideas, a pair of ideas that work together. One is called the Essence Neural Network, and the other is called Deep Distillation, and they work together. Essence neural networks essentially is a new type of neural network with a new type of training regime, not using gradient descent, that allows to learn these neural networks that do particularly well for more symbolic problems. And likewise, the deep distillation process actually takes a trained essence neural network and extracts an equivalent program. And today they have it implemented with Python. And so this seemed to me to be, really topical to the people in the neurosymbolic community. So we wanted to get him on the channel. And also, he's kind of coming at things from a little different perspective, being at a medical school. So, Milo, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me, Paulo. Great to be here.
Yeah, so maybe if you could give us a little bit of your background, kind of what you specialize in, and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So my background's in physics, and most of my prior work has been in developing methods of statistical mechanics, especially non-equilibrium statistical mechanics, to really get at unraveling kind of the seemingly intractable complexity of biological systems, right? So kind of the theme of my lab is what are ways that we can represent and simplify complex systems, especially biological systems? Is there underlying simplicity in the apparent complexity of biological system structure? So a lot of the tools I developed and the methodologies I employ are what traditionally and still in a good part of my lab is what I would say is coming from axiomatic science, right? So the science of coming up with axioms and using these axioms to then derive all of the emergent properties. And we are particularly interested in finding new ways to map systems into a different representation, such that in that representation things become simple or modular or reducible. But more recently, my lab has been interested in kind of the other side of simplifying complex systems, which is kind of oftentimes using different kind of thinking and different kinds of methods, which is informatics science of how do you now not from coming up with the axioms, and then deriving the emergent properties, but starting just from data, can you infer underlying simple rules that explain the data? And I think it's orthogonal and complementary, and I think it's increasingly necessary to integrate the two very disparate, different kind of background disciplines together, especially in a lot of domains I'm interested in here. So biological systems are intrinsically very, very complicated, and a lot of times even generating good causative or mechanistic hypotheses from high dimensional data is really hard. So it's really hard to just like guess good axioms, right? And it's not something that this traditionally we could do that in other areas, but in biology I think it becomes increasingly hard because the observables and the data exist in such high dimensional space. So it's become increasingly clear that in addition to the axiomatic approaches, it's really necessary to develop kind of interpretable informatic approaches. But now with the goal that we can actually use it to generate mechanistic or causative hypotheses that we can then test using axiomatic models. And so the intrinsic nature of that is that it has to be distillable or interpretable from the data, right? So that's a lot of where we are kind of coming from. And that background I think is a bit different from the backgrounds of many people coming at this field or subfield, but I think it's given me kind of maybe a different kind of perspective in kind of how all this comes together, both in terms of just using machine learning to understand as a way to automate generation of scientific theories and principles. But also, a lot of the reasons that we develop these essence neural networks that we'll talk about, I guess, a bit later, is that we also not only want to have better systems for understanding biological complexity, but we want to have systems that actually can mimic a lot of the like organically, without putting handcrafting them in, a lot of the emergent properties of biological neural networks that was also like a compelling reason for us to motivated us to design the algorithm the way that we did. So yeah, it's a bit of a kind of a different background, and I think I would like to note that we didn't start out with the goal of designing any algorithms, right? So this kind of was born out of initial research by a graduate student, and we're both interested in just kind of what is the evolvability of neural circuits, the scalability and evolvability of neural circuits, and then what are the maximum, like computational capabilities in terms of, what they could do, and the number of decision boundaries they can have. And it was through this kind of, I would say, basic science tinkering that we realized we can use some of the things that we learned to actually design an algorithm for training kind of a general purpose supervised learning algorithm. So it's kind of it's been a roundabout journey, and I still kind of curious to see where this all goes and how this all kind of fits in with much larger fields of people thinking and coming from different backgrounds.
Yeah, so you touch on kind of two themes there that I just want to pick your brain on, and one is interpretability. And there's kind of, in neurosymbolic AI, there's really sort of two trains of thoughts. There's one line of thought that this is part of the reason why you want to do neurosymbolic, because symbolic things you can understand. But then there's another line of thinking that you don't really need to understand what's going on, at least for certain applications, but you can use ideas from symbolic reasoning to guide a machine learning process. So like LTNs result in a model that itself is not explainable, but it's guided by logic, right? And the other thing that is a little bit interesting to me, and I'm not sure how it relates to interpretability, is this notion of being biologically inspired. And when you hear guys like Jeff Hinton talk about backpropagation is really powerful, but it's nothing to do with the human brain, which is sort of breaking the intuition of neural networks when you think of it. And then you guys are kind of going back to that. Are these two things related in any way?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like, yeah, to your first point, right? We in my lab is interested, I think, in the first version of like actually being able to interpret the thinking of the neural network itself. And the reason why is because, there's many reasons, but one of the reasons why is that we would like to actually develop this as a platform for automated generation of scientific hypotheses. So then you have to kind of read out in a human interpretive way, essentially what the hypothetical axioms are, so that you can take them and actually like test them, right? So we are actually interested in reading out, and that is, for the set of problems that we've demonstrated on what deep distilling does, reading out the algorithm responsible for generating the patterns in the data in a straightforward, concise manner that we can understand, and have the algorithm be mathematically equivalent to what the neural network is, and not just kind of having the neural network tell us what it thinks an algorithm is, right? Actually be the equivalent computation of what is actually happening in the neural network as it's processing the input. So we're interested in kind of the first form, I guess I would say, like the stronger version of interpretability. But that being said, I think there's just going to be certain problem domains where that's going to not be really tractable, right? Like then that depends on the intrinsic structure and nature of the problem. There might be many problems where it's not reducible to like a concise, manageable set of axioms. You know, like it's not everything is going to have the nice historical parallel with what happens, you know, in the history of physics, right? And so so I think that, you know, the goal of having like symbolic ingredients, right, in the training process is also going to be important for just helping us get to better solutions, right? So like, you know, like something, you know, the weaker form, right, would be something like, you know, like AlphaGo, where there's a decision tree already there that right, that, and then the, you know, the neural network is learning intuition about how to search the decision tree efficiently. And so it's not going to give you like the ground, it's not going to give you like magical like principles of how to be like the universal like principles of Go, but it does allow you to like train a you know, a superior Go player, right? And so I think that's probably going to apply to a lot of domains. But like what kind of my lab is particularly interested in is in the stronger form, which can only apply in certain domains where there actually does exist an underlying generative model for the complexity, right? And we are interested in finding that, and it's traditionally we've been able to just do that through our thinking really hard, but it becomes harder and harder in high dimensional space to have like an automated way to generate these kind of generative axiomatic hypotheses. So that was your first point. And the second point you raised was in terms of like, you know, the the biological, the neurobiological feasibility of like these algorithms themselves, right? So like, so now we're getting into the point of like getting into the question of like, you know, the reason why some of us may do this is also for us to kind of understand ourselves, right, and how we think and how our thinking might have evolved. And so then in that sense, then we want to be asking these questions constrained by not just evolution, but also just constrained by what we know our brain can and can't do, right? And we're pretty sure that our brain cannot access like a global calculation of a gradient. And so there's got to be like some much more local based learning rules, right, that still can work. And you know, I think that is also something that we are really interested in, right? So and you know, to your question then of like how do these things relate to each other, I think that, you know, as someone who's like and you know, like I'm trained as a physicist, but I think of myself as a biologist, right? So you know, I'm kind of inspired by cases of just like, you know, the constraints the constraints of like convergent evolution, right? Where like if there is a powerful way to extract, like a generic powerful way, right? A universal algorithmic class, a generic powerful way to extract a generalizable and interpretable like generative rules from complex data, then there could be a really good chance that the process of evolution, natural selection, could have like selected for finding that route, because that would have enabled scalable evolution of our brains, which does exactly that, right? Which does generate from, you know, sometimes limited data, pretty generalizable like generative rules for explaining what happens. So I think, you know, and this is kind of why we think that, you know, this is a worthy enterprise from the perspective of computational neuroscience, because it's the whole point is to not like design our computational neural network to mimic what we think we know physiologically about the brain, because then in a sense we'll kind of get out what we put in, right? I think it's much more of to me it's more of a satisfying regime where you just put in the constraints or the training training task of the network, and hypothesize that there is a class of universal types of algorithms that many different training regimes will get you to, and that by natural selection or by your particular way of training, you'll converge on the same kind of universality class of solutions. And if you can test that hypothesis, then by like training your neural network that you train with some generalizable training rules on various tasks that actual animals or humans have been trained on, and then independently compare the neurophysiological properties of your network. Like, do they have the same kind of modularity structure in connectivity? Do they have the same kind of firing properties of having both localized and distributed firing without you kind of imposing that in, right? And so one of the things that we showed in our and maybe this is a good time to share the screen. So let's see. There we go. Okay, so in our first ENN paper, right, where we do these with this negative control, where on the right hand side are the results for our essence neural network, and the left hand side are just the corresponding information or results for a network trained using gradient descent, so using backpropagation. And so the one of the things that we know is that if you don't put in additional structure, so if you don't, for example, give the system information about things like that information has local encodings. In other words, if, for example, in this case, you don't give the backpropagation network the additional structure of a convolutional neural net, the resulting properties of a backpropagation trained network is that, first of all, there is no modularity. So here we've grouped neurons together by neurons that so these groupings are neurons that tend to fire tend to fire. This is on the MNISC handwriting recognition task. These are for neurons that tend to fire in this layer for particular numbers, right? And so on the left-hand side, you can see for backpropagation that neurons that tend to fire for the same kind of digits are not any more interconnected to previous neurons in the previous layer than other neurons. Whereas in the ENN, the essence neural network, neurons that tend to fire for the same kind of are associated with firing for the same kind of inputs tend to also have similar connectivity to upstream neurons. So so functional association is correlated with connection, modular connectivity, right? And then the fact that if you now look at not the connection weights up here, but if you look at the firing, you can see that the on not just the on the deeper layers, right? So on some or on the earlier layers, you can get oftentimes what's called distributed firing, where for lots of different kind of neurons will fire for all sorts of different inputs, and that's observed in the brain, where there's certain neurons that they're not associated with any kind of input. They when you see various inputs, they fire or not fire, and there's no kind of discernible pattern. They have distributed firing, right? But oftentimes when you look in some deeper layers, there are particular types of neurons that have localized firing, and they fire only for specific kinds of inputs. So this kind of structure emerges just naturally from kind of the training, the way that the generic training algorithm of ENNs. So this modularity of connectivity and the fact that you have both distributed and localized firing without imposing kind of that kind of structure from the outside. those are kind of things that, like, is interesting for us to be able to get these. This is what I would call like an example of convergent evolution, right? Of if you have the same kind of constraints, and now you have maybe even different algorithms, but the algorithms share features of the same universality class. They have corresponding convergent like properties that you can read out in terms of their system behavior. So that this is maybe a long-winded way of asking your very first kind of substantive question, but I was just trying to put in context both like the question about strong versus weak interpretability, and also the link of like interpretability and and having like the emergent structure be related to like being a biologically plausible model, which is kind of to us, I think it is an important link.
So why don't you walk through kind of the both the architecture and the training procedure, because I know they're both kind of go hand in hand, because I think that will for the viewers that will make it a little more concrete kind of how these as to why these activation patterns that you're observing arise.
Yeah, good. Okay, so let me share screen again. Okay, so what is the like the fundamental idea behind kind of ENN training? So ENNs are their architecture are there's many different kinds that we can envision, right? And some can have many deep layers, but I'm going to focus on the basic ENN, right? Which is a relatively shallow architecture, right? And so you have the input layer here. You have what we call the differential neurons here, and the subconcept neurons here, and then the concept neurons, which is the neuron that actually fires for the output, right? And so in the actual, in terms of the what the individual, the neurons are, they can be any kind of standard neurons encountered, right? Like so they take in weights, they take in inputs and they have weights, linear weights, right? And then they pass them through an activation function, and we can choose them to be a sigmoid or ReLU or whatever. And we can also, in our case, choose the activation function to actually just be a sign function, like a Heaviside function, because it doesn't need to be differentiable. So, and that'll actually be important for the training symbolic essence neural networks that's relevant for the deep distilling paper. But the main idea here is that, so there's nothing special about the architecture or the neurons themselves. The way that makes ENNs different is how we train them, right? And so the basic idea of how to think about ENNs is, again, this comes from our playing around just in terms of like, this came out of a work in which we showed that in evolving neural networks to do various tasks, the vast majority of the evolutionary time, the optimization time, is actually spent in evolving the network to have more decision boundaries. So that really will awaken in us really the importance of decision boundaries in thinking about, how as a way to think about how neural networks compute, right?
So I kind of want to go back on that a little bit. So So what you're saying is, so this observation of decision boundaries, is this from artificial neural networks or actual neural networks?
Artificial neural networks. Artificial.
Okay. Yeah. And so how did you reach that conclusion in observing the training of artificial neural networks, that the decision boundary was kind of the choke point?
Yeah. So these are this was doing computational simulations of neuroevolution. So there, in this case, we were not limited to feed-forward network; they could have recurrence, etc. And we were just evolving neural networks using like the neat or the hyper neat algorithms, right? But to do very simple tasks. And there we were just trying to understand, like, what are the limitations to scaling the evolution of neural networks? And there, and there it's like hard because evolution doesn't have a gradient. There's not very scalable, but that allows us to get us what are the, like, as you say, choke points, right? And what we just observe is that almost all the evolutionary time is actually evolving the parameters so that the neural network can accommodate more decision boundaries. Like once you have another decision boundary to play with, moving those boundaries around to optimally conform to the input-output mapping or your supervised learning task is very, very fast. It just takes forever to like evolve the parameters such that your recurrent neural network has more and more decision boundaries. But that just kind of woke us up in terms of like we should be thinking about like the decision boundaries as the units, and you know, when you think about it, actually, you know, in any neural network, in this kind of neural network, what does a neuron actually do, right? Like a neuron takes in inputs, it scales them, right, and then puts them through like a nonlinear activation. So essentially, what a neuron does, it just makes a decision in its input space, right? It has a decision hyperplane, and things on one side of the hyperplane are, you know, low or false, and things on the other side are high or true. And the nature of your activation function just makes that hyperplane either like, you know, all or none or fuzzy, right? But a neuron really just makes a decision in the high dimensional space. So here, the way that we design the algorithm works is just taking that idea and using that, taking that very, I think, very simple fundamental observation and kind of really running with it, right? So the first thing is that, so if you look here, imagine now we want to have a classifier that distinguishes B versus not B, right? So this is an absolute distinction that you want to absolutely say, given an input, is it B or is it not B? And the idea is that you can actually, you know, you can get that, and that is by itself, it's a little bit harder to do than to do a relative distinction, which is to ask, is something closer to A or closer to B? Because I don't have to commit absolutely to A or B. So this dashed line would, for example, correspond to some optimum line that that distinguishes if something is more A or more B, but it does not have to say if it's something is in B or not. Likewise, here is another dashed line or hyperplane that is optimally telling me if I'm closer to A or closer to D, right here. And the observation is that, like, now if I can use these decision boundaries themselves as the inputs to a downstream neuron, then I can get the absolute distinction of B or not B by knowing that that by combining the relative distinction of this one, A versus B, and this one, A versus D. So the idea in you know, which generalizes to a high dimensional space, is that imagine that you have a convex subspace defining a you know, what we call a subconcept, and that convex space is bounded by all these hyperplanes, right? So so if you now take these hyperplanes as the inputs, it's very easy to define this convex space, because you just have to like know that for each of these hyperplane inputs, you have to be on the correct side of that hyperplane, and then you will bound in yourself inside this convex region. So the idea then is that, you know, the first layer, which are the differentiant layers, right? What they do is okay. I should skip back. So let me define what concepts and subconcepts are. So the concepts for a supervised task are just the output labels, right? So like whatever the types of labels there are, like cat, dog, digits, or whatever. Those are the different concepts. So those are given just by the supervised learning task. Then what happens is that we do a unsupervised clustering within each one of these concepts, so that we separate these concepts into these convex subconcepts, right? So, you know, a cat can be composed of different kinds of cats, right? The label itself is just cat, through unsupervised clustering, you can find that there's different kinds of cats. And those different kinds of cats will be the different subconcepts, okay? So after this, then what the differential neuron does is that each differential neuron is is performing an optimum decision boundary that separates a pair of subconcepts. And so, so for every pair of subconcepts, there would correspond to a differential neuron. And then the subconcept neuron are then, so, and the differential neurons, we usually find them by using support vector machines, right, that find the best decision boundary. And then the weights of that neuron is just read off from like the hyperplane defined by the support vector machine. So you can find that for every pair of subconcepts. So now you have these optimally dividing differential neurons that just tell you, this differential neuron tells you, given an input, is this input closer to, this type of cat or that type of cat, right? And then the subconcept neurons are saying, okay, now using the differential as inputs, so these are using the hyperplanes themselves as the inputs, what is the best way to now, rather than a 1 against 1 pairwise boundary, relative boundary, you will now have a 1 against all way to 1 against all boundary of like this subconcept against all other subconcepts, right? And we also do that using a support vector machine, which is 1 against all. But now the key is that we're doing that, right? We're doing that using the inputs of the previous layer. So the support vector machines are always linear support vector machines, but because on this layer we're doing this we're doing this subconcept delineation using the inputs from the previous layer, they've gone through a nonlinear transformation due to the activation layer, right? And so it is making a nonlinear, it is making a nonlinear boundary, right, for each one of these subconcepts. And then the concept, what it does is then you just unite all concepts that are in the same label. Unite all subconcepts that are in the same concept, i.e. in the same label, back together. So because your concept itself could look like some non-convex disjointed thing in input space, but it's made out of these convex pieces, right, that correspond to the subconcepts.
So, just to kind of push back on that a little, or dig into it, you're doing a linear SVM for the decision by the differential neurons.
Yes.
And then, it makes sense that then now, because since for each subconcept, that's going to, so if you have like K subconcepts across the board for any individual one, you're going to have roughly K of these hyperplanes. And so now you get this nonlinear thing. But why not have the SVMs be nonlinear? Would that make any sense at all to do that? Would that be something suitable or not, or would that be inefficient for some reason?
Yeah, I guess what we're doing is that we're in a sense kind of doing that. We are like, to the previous layer, this is the weights of the subconcepts are found by a linear support vector machine, right? But relative to the input layer, it's essentially a nonlinear support vector machine. So we're kind of doing like the kernel trick using a neural network. But it's not just a single support vector machine, right? It's like a support vector machine corresponding to every one of these subconcepts.
I see. Okay. No, that makes sense. And it's, in many ways, it's just kind of the similar intuition with doing a neural network in the first place, where you have a simpler series of activations, but it builds up to something really complex.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But then the main difference then is that instead of being a top-down optimization, it is a bottom-up, right? Because we train this the relative distinctions, these ingredients first, and then we use these ingredients to make the more complex subconcept boundaries subsequently. And because it's a bottom up rather than top down, that's what makes it interpretable, because now we can assign meaning to what this neuron does. This neuron is distinguishing between this kind of subconcept and that kind of, it has a particular defined task. And we also know what this neuron does because it is now defining that subconcept. Whereas with backpropagation, you are optimizing, I guess, from top down, right, your loss function. And so when you do that, it's you don't have like an individualized modular role that you predefine that is preserved as you integrate it into like the larger computation of the network. And because of that, like what each neuron does kind of just gets entangled with minimizing the loss function.
So one thing, with the top-down approach, RNNs and CNNs gives a byproduct of that or a capability rather, is to have neural modules that share weights, especially for the RNN, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there kind of an analog in ENN to shared weights?
Yeah. Zero. Yeah, I mean, in the basic vanilla case, that's not like that's not put in, but there are versions of this in which we can now have something like, for example, a consensus ENN, where we have, for example, different ways to define the subconcepts, right? So you might have different criteria for clustering, for example, or you maybe have different clustering depth. And so you have different ways to define what these subconcepts should be to like do the problem well, right? So then you have maybe two different representations of it. But those representations could be very much related to each other. And so there could be a sense of shared weights, right? So now you can have a consensus CNN where you can go through this route or that route, and then you can build in like a way to like make use of alternative interpretations of the problem structure based on different kinds of inputs. So then you can kind of get it like a consensus output based on like in a sense like an ensemble of alternate models. And there, because these alternate models are going to have a lot of similarities, there's going to be shared weights.
I see. Okay. And then what goes on when you add the convolutional layers to the bottom of the ENN? Because I know you've done that with some vision. I see it depicted here as well.
Yeah, we haven't done as much with the convolutional stuff. So like that this is where I think it's important to talk about kind of what do we lose from doing all of this, right? Like what are the downsides of doing this? Like I'm talking about like, okay, we get this interpretability, it's bottom up. One of the things I think that we lose from this is that we don't get end-to-end optimization. So you can't just stick you can't just stick ingredients that you like and do an end-to-end optimization over the whole thing, right? So like for the convolutional ENNs, like we had to like optimize like how to train the convolutional layers independently, right? So we did that, one just like in the context of the ENN, in terms of like a gradientless optimization. But oftentimes, it's like sometimes convenient to actually use pre-trained representations. Like you can take a convolutional ENN and the simplest thing to do is to take an ENN, to take the convolutional layers. So you take the convolutional representation trained through like backpropagation. and then you can append it in front of this so that like the remaining cognitive or reasoning part of the network is still interpretable. But that comes at I think generally at a cost of like ease and performance, right? Because you're not end-to-end optimizing your entire network for that particular problem at hand.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So so with this, so this was the first of the two Nature computational science articles you had. And then, really wanted to talk about now, you have the trained network. So you have all the, the well-trained neurons from this process you just outlined. How do we go from that to code? And also what kind of problems that you had some, and I think you've had some really interesting results where you've actually produced code for certain cases.
Yeah. So okay, so here that the idea, so like on some of the tasks that we trained this on in our first paper, because of the nature of the way it's trained, things are so interpretable that we can in many cases just read off the weights of the neural network and understand what the network is doing. And so for the second paper, we thought, okay, let's actually demonstrate kind of the logical conclusion of this, like how interpretable is it, and is like let's do it in like a a non-subjective way, right? Because if I say, okay, here's a neural network and it has like thousands of parameters, and I'm able to like look at the weights and I'm able to figure out what it's doing, that's not saying something very objective, right? Like in terms of interpretability, right? So the objective way to really evaluate if these ENNs are intrinsically learning something really interpretable is that if I train my ENN on some learning task, there should be a little script, right, or some kind of script that you can write, right, that should scan the weights of the ENN and automatically condense the weights of the ENN into like an equivalent, say, Python code that is basically then the algorithm that is that the ENN learned for how inputs map to outputs, and that the algorithm should actually ideally be mathematically equivalent to the ENN. So it's just literally scanning and reading the weights and converting them, and it's not doing some kind of like potentially lossy like meta interpretation, right? Like it should just be equivalent, right? I think that would be like the strong objective case to say that these networks are interpretable themselves. So that's kind of what we set out to do in this paper. And basically, the way that we do that is that we first, we apply this first to what we call symbolic ENNs, where we thought this would even have some likelihood of working out, in the sense that we applied it to problems that had a reasonable chance where either we knew because we knew the ground truth, or the nature of the problem had a really reasonable chance to have like a really good underlying generative or symbolic solution or algorithm, right? Even if it's like a greedy algorithm that's not perfect. So that's one. So those are the kind of problems that we applied it to. And second, we then forced the ENN to be what we call symbolic ENN, in the sense that now instead of a sigmoid, for example, the activation function is the sign function or heavy side. So it's just 0 or 1 outputs, because like we thought that was going to be as close as possible to like a neural network doing some kind of symbolic computation, in that it's not having access to a whole bunch of different real numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the weights themselves, of course, can still be real numbers, but we force the outputs to just be binary. So so the idea there is that what the condenser code does is it basically does two things. It first tries to find organized neurons, so it can find basically, are there like good effective variables, right? Is there like for loops to write that can condense a lot of like, a lot of weights coming in that are very much redundant, both in terms of like the inputs to a neuron, as well as to many, many other neurons that take the same kind of weights from the input. So for example, like a case where you have a neuron that basically reads in, let's say the input is a vector, and it reads in every element of the vector except the second element, right? And it just reads in and reads them in and sums them up. It doesn't, it doesn't like multiply each one by some weird like real number. It just says, okay, it's what's important is that I consider everything except the second element, or I consider every row of the matrix except the second row, right? You can imagine another neuron that what it essentially does is like it takes not the second one, but like it checks and takes in every element of the vector except the fifth vector index. Those two are essentially the same neurons. They're just looking for different indices, and they're looking at the negative, right? They're looking at everything except one index. They might prefer different indices, but essentially they're like the same kind of neurons. They might take the vector or might have hundreds of entries, but if this neuron is actually the underlying symbolic manipulation is that it's only caring about what everything except the third, fourth, and fifth entry is doing, and if this neuron is caring about everything except what the first, second, and third entry is doing, these two neurons are essentially the same. They're just having I don't want to say attention because that has connotations now, but they're just paying attention to different indices, right? And also like the vector could have lots and lots of indices, but it's only caring about a few of them, or it's caring about a lot of them, but they're all like have the same weight. That you're just adding them together. You're not applying, or you're applying like just a couple of small, just a couple of different weights. Like maybe there's only 3 or 4 weights, so you have thousands of inputs, but you classify some as important with high weight, and some as medium with low weight, and some input as not important with 0 weight, right? So there's basically 3 parameters in this case, and you're just sorting your inputs by important, very important, not medium important, and not important. So there's a potential for a vast condensation of information, because instead of writing all the weights individually and having a lot of the weights be like the same number, right? You can condense that into like saying like this is a particular pattern of input, and then again not having to like repeat that again for their next neuron. The next neuron might have the same pattern of input, but there just has like it's just having that same pattern of input, but with different indices of your input, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what the condenser does. It just looks for these kinds of patterns, right? And it just writes like it just like writes for loops to make effective variables, right? And assign them to the assign effective variables to a lot of these different kinds of like repeat structures. So it's organizing these neurons by connectivity. So and then what the second part of the condenser does is it interprets like what the neuron function, what the neuronal functions are in terms of like the collective variables that it's found, right? So here's examples of like types of like logical things it would do based on its weights. Like for example, if like you have all your weights, right? Such that adding them all, right, plus the the bias is positive. But if you now change any of the So if you have all of them, right, if you add all of the inputs and it's greater than, in this case, I guess 0.5, right? Here's what it looks like for this a simple example of just like two inputs, right? It's essentially doing an OR function, right? So that would be a case of like a disjunction, right? So likewise, you can have a conjunction where you need every single one of the inputs to be at a certain value. Otherwise, it goes below the bias, right? And that would be an AND function. So you can, you can convert these kinds of like, conditions where you change here. If you change any one of the inputs, it's like it's no longer satisfied. That would fall under this conjunction, right? So you would basically map these kinds of network weight relationships into logical code, logical statements. And you can get these things to be nested, right? So for example, let's say it looks like this, where the decision boundary of like the output, right, is this red dashed line here, right? And so, and in many cases, we find that, like, for example, like the effective variable, two effective variables come into play, and in many cases, the effective variable of one is much bigger than the effective variable of the other. And so what that really means is that, like, that's in this case, for example, that just converts to like, so if this D2 is bigger than, it was 1, 2, 3, right? Then it's true no matter what. And if it's less than 3, then it's false no matter what. But if it's at 3, right, then you have to look at what D1 is, right? In this case, like, if if D2 is at the tie point, you look at D1, and if D1 is bigger than 7, then you return true, right? So it's basically, it's getting like this part, right? So this part here. So you can have these things where you have multi-dimensional effective variables coming in with a decision boundary, and you can convert that multi-dimensional decision boundary into just a nested logic statement. So that's kind of what it does. It's just like we just have like a bunch of kind of the first case, we have a bunch of possible like input patterns from the inputs, right, that we can organize into effective variables. And the second one, we just look for how converting the relationships of the effective variables and the downstream neurons to logic or nested logic statements. So
go ahead.
Yeah, so you asked about like what does it actually look like, right? So the first problem we applied it to is the cellular automata, right? So for example, this is John Conway's Game of Life, which is a 2D cellular automata, and here the training data is like so the cellular automata are like, you have this grids of white and black, and then there is the dynamics of the system that's encoded by just simple nearest neighbor rules, where a white pixel will either stay white or turn black based on the patterns of its immediate neighbors, and same with black pixel according to like it will sort of stay black or turn white according to rules based on what its immediate nearest neighbors are. And this thing then then the dynamics of the whole grid progresses. And the task here is that now you have examples where the training data is, here are the things in which the center, which is like the center pixel dies, and then here are the examples where the center pixel lives. And so it's basically like asking, if I show you a bunch of like essentially like movies of like these 2D cellular automata, could you infer back the generative rules of like what makes a center live, or what makes a cell live, or what makes a cell die, right?
So your samples with the Game of Life, did they consist of like consecutive frames of the game being in play, or was it like an entire sequence?
Oh yeah, so it just consisted of a set of a set of images that, in which like this. So the task is just to predict what happens. The task is just to predict the rule for the center pixel. Okay.
Uh-huh.
So and you're given like a whole grid, and so the training data is like, here's uh, a bunch of like grids in which on the next iteration the center would live or would die, and then there's another set of trading grids in which on the next iteration the center would live, right? So they're just given like pairs of you can think of it, they're just pairs of like grid plus what happens next to the center of the grid.
Okay, I see. So, well, as we wrap up,
Yeah.
what do you think the future of this looks like? Like, what are the next challenges for ENNs and deep distilling, and what problems are you looking to tackle with this?
Yeah. So the reason why we chose Game of Life is that, this was an example. This was like to us like a very, very toy example of like sequence to function, which is kind of like, or genotype to phenotype, which is like, kind of the whole story of what we want to do in biology, right? We're given observables that are a result of underlying generative rules, and we want to infer like the molecular, in many cases, in molecular mechanism of what the rules are that gave rise to the observables, right? And so in this case, the system is not told that the rule is local, but the ENN is able to figure out that the rule is local. So which is important because otherwise, it would take like exponential number of training images to get the right result, right? So but like what we want to do then, is to take this to like real biological systems then to say, okay, for example, there's data sets now in which we know that, for example, certain sequences of RNA will induce their associated protein to form amyloid fibrils, and other sequences of RNA don't. And it's not clear from just staring at the RNA sequences, there's not clear that human cannot just suss out what the generative rules are, but could we learn the underlying rule of like how the sequence determined the fate of this molecular system, right? And so that would be an example of like kind of a high dimensional biological mechanism that we want to apply this ENN to. And this also, these are examples where the ENN was pretty small, but on other tasks like this object orientation task or other tasks, the ENN could be millions of parameters, but like the distilled code could still be very concise, like 50 or 60 lines of code. So we're hopeful that for certain problems in biological in biology, especially molecular biology, that we can generate hypotheses of like what are the interactions, the molecular interactions that govern the outcomes that we see. So for my lab, that's like kind of a lot of where my interests are, because that's a lot of our experience is in understanding how proteins and other molecular systems encode information. And we've had a lot of progress using axiomatic science, and that's how the field has always done it. But we feel like, given the high dimensional nature of this problem, it can also benefit really from this informatic approach, that would be like on the next application of this.
No, that's really cool. Well, thank you for taking the time today, Milo. I think this is really exciting work. And we'll put some links to the paper in the description, but thanks again.